The year was 1984. While the world celebrated Olympic achievements and watched MTV music videos, a silent killer was spreading through vials of medicine meant to save lives. What if I told you that a pharmaceutical giant knowingly sold contaminated blood products that infected thousands of people with HIV? What if I told you they continued selling these deadly products even after they knew they were contaminated? This is the story of one of the most shocking medical scandals in modern history. A tale of corporate negligence that would forever change how we view pharmaceutical companies and medical ethics. Picture this. You're a hemophiliac in the early 1980s. Your blood doesn't clot properly, which means even small cuts can be life-threatening. But there's hope. Medical advances have created clotting factor concentrates derived from donated blood plasma. These products promise you a normal life, the ability to play sports, travel, and live without constant fear of bleeding to death. You trust the pharmaceutical companies producing these medicines. You trust the regulatory agencies overseeing them. You trust the medical system that prescribes them. But sometimes, trust can be deadly. The Bayer Corporation, through its subsidiary Cutter Biological, was one of the leading manufacturers of these clotting factor concentrates. They collected blood plasma from thousands of donors across the United States, processed it into concentrated clotting factors, and distributed it worldwide. The process seemed scientific, regulated, and safe. But beneath the surface of this life-saving industry lurked a catastrophe waiting to unfold. In the early 1980s, reports began emerging of a mysterious new disease affecting primarily gay men, drug users, and hemophiliacs. Scientists didn't yet understand what caused this immune system collapse, but they noticed disturbing patterns. The disease seemed to spread through blood and sexual contact. By 1982, they had a name for it: acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. As researchers scrambled to understand this new plague, alarm bells should have been ringing in pharmaceutical boardrooms. If AIDS spread through blood, then blood products used to treat hemophiliacs could be vectors for transmission. The math was terrifying. Each batch of clotting factor concentrate was made from blood donated by thousands of people. If even one donor was infected, the entire batch could become a weapon of mass infection. But here's where this story takes a dark turn. Internal documents would later reveal that Bayer executives were aware of the AIDS risk as early as 1982. They knew their products could be contaminated. They knew hemophiliacs were dying from AIDS at alarming rates. Yet they continued manufacturing and selling their clotting factor concentrates using the same methods, with the same risks, for 2 more years. The pharmaceutical industry had access to heat treatment technology that could eliminate the AIDS virus from blood products. This process, called pasteurization, involved heating the blood products to temperatures that would kill viruses while preserving the clotting factors. It was more expensive and time-consuming than traditional methods, but it could save lives. Bayer and other companies knew about this technology. Some even developed their own versions of heat-treated products. But they were slow to implement these safety measures across their entire product lines. Why the delay? Internal corporate documents tell a chilling story of profit calculations and risk assessments. Bayer had massive inventories of untreated clotting factor concentrates. Destroying these products would mean millions of dollars in losses. Retooling factories for heat treatment would require significant investments. Meanwhile, their existing products were still legally approved for sale. From a pure business perspective, the rational decision was to sell through their existing inventory before switching to safer alternatives. But the human cost of this business calculation was staggering. By 1984, hundreds of hemophiliacs in the United States were dying from AIDS. The pattern was unmistakable. People who used clotting factor concentrates were contracting AIDS at rates far higher than the general population. Families watched their loved ones waste away from a disease they contracted while trying to manage their bleeding disorder. Children who had received blood products during surgery or developing AIDS symptoms. The very medicine meant to save lives was ending them. As evidence mounted that blood products were spreading AIDS, regulatory pressure increased in the United States. The Food and Drug Administration began demanding that companies recall untreated products and switch to heat-treated alternatives. But here's where Bayer's actions become truly unconscionable. Instead of destroying their contaminated inventory, they decided to sell it overseas. Internal memos reveal a calculated strategy to dump dangerous products on international markets. Countries in Asia, Latin America, and Europe became dumping grounds for blood products that were no longer considered safe enough for American patients. Bayer executives reasoned that these countries had less stringent regulatory oversight and fewer resources to detect contamination. They could sell their deadly inventory and recoup their losses while avoiding the expense of proper disposal. The company's own documents show they understood the implications of this strategy. They knew they were potentially spreading AIDS to hemophiliacs around the world. They knew these patients trusted their products and had no way of knowing about the contamination risks. Yet they proceeded anyway, prioritizing corporate profits over human lives on a global scale. In Taiwan, Argentina, Malaysia, and other countries, hemophiliacs began contracting AIDS after using Bayer's clotting factor concentrates. Families who had never heard of AIDS found themselves dealing with a mysterious disease that their doctors couldn't fully explain. Children developed immune deficiencies after routine treatments for their bleeding disorders. The geographical spread of these infections created a clear trail back to Bayer's contaminated products. By the mid-1980s, the scope of this disaster was becoming clear. Thousands of hemophiliacs worldwide had contracted HIV through contaminated blood products. In the United States alone, over 4,000 hemophiliacs became infected with HIV during this period. Many of them died from AIDS-related complications over the following decades. The global death toll would eventually reach into the tens of thousands. But the cover-up was just beginning. As lawsuits started piling up and regulatory investigations intensified, Bayer and other pharmaceutical companies mounted aggressive legal defenses. They argued that AIDS was a new disease that nobody fully understood in the early 1980s. They claimed they acted according to the scientific knowledge and regulatory standards of their time. They portrayed themselves as victims of an unprecedented medical crisis rather than perpetrators of corporate negligence. These legal arguments might have been more convincing if not for the damning internal documents that eventually came to light. Corporate memos revealed that company executives had detailed discussions about AIDS risks as early as 1982. They calculated the financial costs of switching to heat-treated products. They strategized about how to sell contaminated inventory in less regulated markets. They even joked in internal communications about the desperation of hemophiliacs who needed their products to survive. One particularly chilling document showed Bayer executives discussing whether to warn international customers about potential AIDS contamination in their products. The consensus was that such warnings might hurt sales and weren't legally required in most countries. They decided to remain silent and let customers make uninformed decisions about products that could kill them. The investigations that followed read like corporate thrillers. Journalists uncovered internal documents through Freedom of Information requests and leaked sources. Attorneys representing infected hemophiliacs used discovery processes to access corporate archives that revealed the full scope of the cover-up. Regulatory agencies launched criminal investigations into whether pharmaceutical executives should face charges for knowingly distributing contaminated products. Congressional hearings brought pharmaceutical executives before cameras to testify about their actions. These sessions were dramatic confrontations between grieving families and corporate leaders trying to minimize their responsibility. Senators and representatives grilled company officials about specific decisions, demanding explanations for why they continued selling products they knew were dangerous. The legal battles stretched on for years. Class action lawsuits sought compensation for infected hemophiliacs and their families. Individual wrongful death suits aimed to hold companies accountable for specific victims. Corporate defendants spent millions on legal fees while fighting to limit their liability and avoid criminal charges. Eventually, the evidence became overwhelming. Courts found that pharmaceutical companies had indeed acted negligently in continuing to sell contaminated products after becoming aware of AIDS risks. Juries awarded damages to infected patients and families of those who died. Settlement agreements totaling billions of dollars were reached with various pharmaceutical companies, including Bayer. But money could never truly compensate for the human devastation caused by this scandal. Entire families were destroyed when hemophiliacs contracted HIV and developed AIDS. Children grew up without parents who died from contaminated blood products. Spouses became widowed after their partners succumbed to AIDS complications. The ripple effects of these infections spread through communities, affecting not just hemophiliacs, but their sexual partners and children born to infected mothers. The psychological trauma extended beyond the physical health consequences. Hemophiliacs who survived HIV infection lived with constant fear about their health status and life expectancy. They faced stigma associated with AIDS at a time when the disease was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. Many struggled with depression, anxiety, and survivor guilt as they watched friends and family members die from the same contaminated products they had used. Healthcare providers who had prescribed these products also grappled with feelings of complicity and helplessness. Doctors who had recommended clotting factor concentrates to their patients discovered they had inadvertently contributed to their infections. The trust between physicians and patients was damaged as people questioned whether medical recommendations could be trusted when they came with hidden corporate agendas. This scandal fundamentally changed how we think about pharmaceutical regulation and corporate responsibility. It exposed the dangers of allowing companies to self-police their safety standards, especially when financial incentives conflict with public health. The disaster demonstrated that regulatory agencies needed more aggressive oversight powers and that criminal penalties might be necessary to deter corporate negligence in life or death situations. The international dimension of this scandal also revealed the need for global coordination in pharmaceutical safety. Companies couldn't be allowed to dump dangerous products in countries with weaker regulatory systems. The World Health Organization and other international bodies began developing frameworks for sharing safety information and coordinating responses to public health threats. Blood banking and plasma collection industries implemented sweeping reforms in response to this crisis. New testing protocols were developed to screen for HIV and other blood-borne pathogens. Heat treatment became standard practice for all blood products. Donor screening processes were enhanced to exclude high-risk individuals. These changes made the blood supply much safer, but they came too late for the thousands who had already been infected. The scandal also accelerated research into synthetic alternatives to blood-derived products. Scientists worked to develop genetically engineered clotting factors that didn't require human blood plasma. These products eliminated the risk of blood-borne pathogen transmission while providing effective treatment for hemophilia. The development of these synthetic alternatives represented both a technological triumph and a tragic reminder of why they were necessary. Legal reforms emerged from the litigation surrounding contaminated blood products. Courts established new precedents for corporate liability in cases involving defective medical products. Regulatory agencies gained expanded powers to recall dangerous products and impose criminal penalties on executives who knowingly endanger public safety. Whistleblower protections were strengthened to encourage employees to report corporate misconduct. But perhaps the most important legacy of this scandal is its impact on public consciousness about pharmaceutical ethics. The image of drug companies as benevolent healers was forever tarnished by revelations that some executives valued profits more than human lives. This skepticism has persisted and influences public debates about drug pricing, clinical trial ethics, and regulatory capture to this day. The families affected by contaminated blood products became powerful advocates for transparency and accountability in healthcare. Support groups formed to help survivors cope with their infections and fight for compensation. Activists pushed for stronger disclosure requirements and criminal penalties for corporate executives who endanger public health. Their advocacy contributed to broader movements for patient rights and corporate accountability. Today, the HIV blood scandal serves as a cautionary tale studied in medical schools, business ethics courses, and public policy programs. It illustrates how corporate incentives can conflict with public health, how regulatory systems can fail when they rely too heavily on industry self-policing, and how the costs of negligence can extend far beyond immediate financial calculations. The pharmaceutical industry has undergone significant changes since the 1980s, but questions remain about whether adequate safeguards exist to prevent similar disasters. Generic drug contamination scandals, opioid epidemic cover-ups, and other recent pharmaceutical controversies suggest that the fundamental tensions between profit and public health persist. For hemophiliacs today, treatment options are vastly safer than they were in the 1980s. Synthetic clotting factors eliminate the risk of blood-borne pathogen transmission. Advanced testing protocols ensure that any blood-derived products are thoroughly screened for known viruses. But the community remains wary of pharmaceutical companies and vigilant about potential safety risks. The Bayer HIV blood scandal represents one of the darkest chapters in pharmaceutical history, a stark reminder that corporate negligence can have devastating consequences for vulnerable patient populations. It demonstrates the critical importance of robust regulatory oversight, transparent safety reporting, and criminal accountability for executives who prioritize profits over human lives. As we continue to rely on pharmaceutical companies for life-saving medications, this scandal reminds us to remain vigilant about corporate accountability and to demand that patient safety always comes first, regardless of the financial costs involved. The thousands who died from contaminated blood products paid the ultimate price for corporate negligence, and their memory demands that we never allow such a tragedy to happen again. The story of contaminated blood products is ultimately a story about trust betrayed and lives lost. But it's also a story about the power of investigation, litigation, and advocacy to hold corporations accountable and prevent future disasters. In remembering this tragedy, we honor not only those who died, but also those who fought to expose the truth and create a safer future for patients around the world.